Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Hello, True Drews, and welcome back to another episode of True Drew Podcast, where today we're going to be covering probably one of the craziest Nancy Drew books I've read in a long time, Captive Witness. Okay, so a few things to know about this book. This is the 64th book in the Nancy Drew series, and it came out in 1981. Now, I know at the end of last week's episode on the Twin Dilemma, I talked a little bit about this book because we were going to be covering it this week, and I said if you like American propaganda and James Bond-esque villains, you're going to love this book. This book is, to put it lightly, unhinged, because, I mean, Nancy's not even so much solving a mystery in this book, I would even say. She, gets involved in politics on a geopolitical level. She's, international. This is spy level stuff in this book. So another thing that's really important to note about this book and when it was written, so it was written in 1981. This was during the height of the Cold War, so tensions were high all around the world, especially with Eastern European countries that were communist, Germany, East Germany at least, Hungary, a couple others. So that plays very heavily into the plot of this book, and it kind of startled me when I started reading it. I was like, wait, what's happening? I thought we were solving a mystery, but instead we're smuggling kids over the border from these communist countries. It's just wild. So now that you have that little bit of background, historical context, a lot of what's about to happen in this episode might make a little more sense. It may not. I may be giving it too much credit because this book is just all over the place, but I will be honest, it was very entertaining, which I never thought that a book based in Cold War times could be entertaining, but here we are. There's a first time for everything. So now let's discuss some of the covers that we see for Captive Witness. I was able to find 4 separate covers for this book. So I've got to say the cover that is most common for this book, it is beautiful. This cover is probably one of my favorites. It was really intriguing the first time I saw it. This made me want to read this book because Nancy's on the cover in this beautiful red ball gown. She's running from these 2 shadowy figures and they're shining a flashlight in the dark trying to find her. Her hair's up in a bun. It's just really interesting looking, and this is something you have to know about me. If there's a book with a heroine on the cover with a ball gown on, I am probably 9 times out of 10 going to read the book because I have so many questions, like, why are you dressed so nice? Where are you going? I want to know. So the second version of this book cover that I was able to find is very similar, except those 2 shadowy figures are a lot closer to Nancy, and she's hiding behind a tree, and her dress is still red, but very different. It's got these flowing sleeves, it's got some ruffles to it, she's got flowers in her hair. If this is espionage, then sign me up, because she is dressed to the nines. Also, I don't know if it's just me, but Nancy on both of these covers, she looks like she would be at home on the cover of a 1980s romance novel. I think it's the dress and the wispy hair, but she would be at home on one of those. And probably out of the original series, this is probably the most romance novel type looking cover until we get to the Nancy Drew files. Then they're all about romance on the covers of those books, it seems like. Also, most of you probably know the spiel by now, but if you do want to see these book covers before these episodes air, I post them on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, on Wednesdays. Now, the third edition of this cover shows Nancy, and I believe that's supposed to be Eric. He's one of the characters in the book. He's got blonde hair. They're both wearing wetsuits and carrying these kids who are orphans, and they are in this kind of shallow water in these cattails. They're hiding from a searchlight beam on a boat, so very mysterious looking. And I'm sorry, I just realized it sounded like I was laughing because they're orphans. I'm not laughing because they're orphans. I'm laughing because there's inner tubes and grease paint involved in this scene in the book. We'll get to it soon enough. It's just crazy. There's also a tagline on this book cover edition, and it says, "The future freedom of 10 orphans is in Nancy's hands." No pressure though, no pressure. But it's interesting because the Nancy on this cover looks a lot like the Nancy on Mystery of the Misty Canyon, which is book number 86, so I'm assuming the same artist did both of those. And the fourth and final edition of this book cover shows Nancy in a wetsuit deep in the water with this line of inner tubes behind her. It's a very dark cover. There's like lightning striking in the background, but the tagline on this one is almost the same. It says 10 children depend on Nancy for their freedom. So I came up with a couple of funny cover spoofs, and the first one I came up with is for the book covers where Nancy's wearing a ball gown and she looks like she's, walked right off the cover of a 1980s romance novel, but I think we need a little background music to accompany this. Coming this fall from the same authors who brought you romance novels like The Accidental Wedding and Sugar and Spice comes a new romance that transcends boundaries and borders. Frigid Liaisons, a Cold War romance, coming this fall. Oh my gosh, I couldn't help it. I had to. Also, if you follow me over on my subscription podcast, True Drew Files, I know you recognize that theme. That's the one from the Nancy Drew dating game episodes that I do over there. They're so fun. Now, as far as a funny cover spoof goes for the cover where Nancy has that line of inner tubes behind her, I don't really have a really catchy one, but it looks like Nancy's sneaking into a pool at a hotel after 10 p.m. because, they always have that sign that says, no swimming after 10 p.m. And it's like, it's 10:05. Nobody's going to catch me. But as far as giving these covers a rating, I would give them 5 magnifying glasses, except maybe the third one. I would probably give it like a 2 or 3. It's not as cool as the other ones. I love the ones where Nancy is in a ball gown, though. And I remember the first time I picked up this book, I was like, oh, the cover is beautiful. The book's going to be fantastic. And then I read the book and I was like, no. This is what they mean by don't judge a book by its cover. And I have to admit, this is the second time that I read the book for this podcast episode, and I thought it would make more sense the second time around, and it didn't. So now let's jump into some of the characters that we see in Captive Witness. So first up we have Professor Raymond Bagley, who's the professor leading this tour that the group is on. There's Eric Nagy, I believe that's how you say his last name. He's a student who's in a wheelchair and he's also in the tour. He's the one depicted on the third book cover. There is Adolf Guterman, and I just put mustache in parentheses because that's a identifier. He's also, spoiler alert, a villain, so if you can just picture any old vaudeville villain with a twirly mustache, that is Adolf Guterman. Also, they just had to name him Adolf. Like, the people who write the books, they were just like, yep, it's a book about, Eastern Germany and Eastern European countries. He's going to be named Adolf. But he's not the first Adolf. There was actually an Adolf Tooker in the Password to Larkspur Lane. He was also a bad guy, so go figure. There's also a guy named Kurt Kessler, who's a filmmaker, which made me think of Rolf Kessler from the Haunted Carousel game, but not the same thing. There is Herr Berger, Richard Ernst, who is a festival contact that Nancy has in the book, Robert Haberman, who's an informant, and Emil Popov, I believe that's how you say his name, and he helps smuggle the children out of the country. So I'll go ahead and read a brief synopsis for Captive Witness. Nancy heads off on a group tour of Austria, but things don't go as planned. Their bus driver is kidnapped, Professor Bagley's luggage is almost stolen, and Nancy quickly gets wrapped up in a case of international intrigue. And now for a quick newspaper headline synopsis. A captivating case. Nancy Drew helps lost film of Kurt Kessler come to light. I don't think the newspapers would mention the border crossing of the kids, as it was kind of a covert operation. Okay, so now here comes the fun part. We're going to discuss the direct quotes and notes for this crazy, crazy book. So we start this quote-unquote mystery with Nancy standing in the Munich, Germany airport reading a cablegram from her father, and Carson says he has a case involving a film that was stolen from the Vienna Film Festival. I didn't really know what a cablegram was. Like, I've heard of a telegram, never heard of a cablegram. And I kind of felt like Buddy the Elf, like, what's a cablegram? I want one. But it's really just a telegraph message sent by cable. That's it. So Nancy gets one of those, and she's actually here on this trip to Austria, and it's sponsored by Emerson College with Ned, Bert, Dave, Bess, and George. So the whole group is here in Austria. It's funny too, and I made a note of this, but the book calls Ned Nancy's special friend and most ardent admirer. Again, with the special friend stuff, like we've been doing this for several books now. Ned is Nancy's boyfriend. He's her boyfriend, like on and off, but That's what he is. Special friend just sounds weird. So Professor Bagley, who is leading this tour, asks if everyone is there, and they realize that Bess and Dave are missing. And George, naturally, takes this time to make fun of Bess and says she bets they've found a snack bar. I don't know what somebody put in George's sauerkraut, but she is always so needlessly rude to Bess, but it's a little more on the tame side for George, but still, she's on my list. So about that time, a porter comes up and addresses Professor Bagley and asks to be permitted to help with his luggage. And Ned teases his teacher and says he knew he was an expert in art and music, but didn't know he was internationally known. Also, if you heard the song It Takes Two by Rob Bass and DJ Easy Rock in your head just then, we can be friends. I'm not internationally known. But anyways, Professor Bagley is not happy about this man taking his luggage, which has U.S. government insignia on it, so he protests, but the porter still takes his bags. So Professor Bagley asks aloud what's going on, and Nancy says, "I think, sir, that he's stealing your bags." I can just picture Nancy doing this because she loves to state the obvious sometimes. So Ned, Bert, George, and Nancy take off after this man, but the guys and George end up toppling over some suitcases, leaving Nancy in the lead. So Nancy ends up in front of this guy and the cart he's pushing, and he demands that she move, and Nancy says she won't move until he returns the bags. So he tries to ram her with the cart. Now this is where Nancy 2.0 kicks in, because Nancy pulls the most boss move. She just jumps up, grabs onto a pipe out of nowhere that must be hanging from the ceiling, and she kicks and lands on the man's shoulders somehow. So this sends him careening into a wall, and Nancy grabs the professor's bags. And then to add to the crazy, like, movie montage quality of all of it, the man points a finger at Nancy and he says, "You get in our way again, Nancy Drew, I will get you. I will take care of you myself." Then he jumps into a waiting black sedan and takes off. Something tells me this is not going to be a vacation. This is going to be an investigation. So the book says the professor has a leg injury from army service, so that's why he didn't take off after his own bags. He couldn't really catch up to the thief. But Nancy notes that he seems too calm about the entire thing. He's not so worried that his luggage was almost stolen, and he asks if the man took anything out of his bag, and Nancy says no. So the thief incident pushed aside, everyone boards the tour bus that they're supposed to get on, and Nancy stops to speak to a student named Eric Nagy, who is 20 and in a wheelchair. So the book specifically mentions that he is in a wheelchair, and it's a key plot point, so keep that in your mind. But Eric is originally from Hungary, and his parents moved them to River Heights years ago, and he was recently in a car accident that left him paralyzed. Now, at this point, Bess and Dave make their appearance. They show up and board the bus, and Nancy catches Bess up to speed on what happened. You know, Professor Bagley's bags almost getting stolen. So while they're talking, they hear banging and thumping coming from under the bus, but when Bess and Nancy tell the driver, he says it's probably just a tool bouncing around. Now, this is a Nancy Drew book, so there is no way that it's a screwdriver or some loose nuts and bolts underneath this bus. We'll see what's happening soon enough. The bus driver is also a jerk. He calls them Frauleins, and then he's just mean to them. He's just like, "Go sit down." So they later stop at a rest stop, and Nancy has to hang back to fix her shoelace and tie her shoes, and when she does, she sees the bus driver pull an engine part out of the bus and hurl it into the bushes. So why is he sabotaging their bus? So the bus driver eventually enters the restaurant after the whole group has gone in and they're eating, and he says the bus isn't working and he'll need to order a part, so there's no way they can continue their journey. Like, he actually says that the soonest they're going to be able to leave is tomorrow, but Nancy, like a cat with a canary, comes in holding this distributor cap that he threw in the bushes and says, "Do you suppose this would help you repair your bus, Mr. Expert Mechanic?" So he splutters and says he doesn't need a woman's help, and Nancy tells the professor what she saw. She's like, "Yeah, he took this part out of the engine and threw it in the bushes. Like, he did this himself." And so the man tries to run away and escapes out of a window with Ned chasing him. And then this black sedan barrels down on him and Ned out of nowhere, and Ned barely gets out of the way. So the car gets away, and Ned comments that it barely made any noise. He was like, "I didn't even hear that car coming up on me." Which, I mean, you know, you think about it, like maybe adrenaline was going, you know, through his veins. Like, I mean, I've heard that sometimes you don't hear things or see things correctly when you're in that fight or flight moment, but he makes that comment, so maybe there's something to it. Maybe that that car is a little bit more quiet than other cars. Also, we saw a black sedan at the airport that the porter jumped into, so this is the second black sedan we've seen in just a few hours. But Nancy comes to the conclusion, she's like, maybe it's a custom-made sedan. So the next thing to happen is Nancy asks Professor Bagley to explain what's going on. She noticed that the man driving the sedan was the porter who tried to steal the luggage at the airport, meaning the incidents are connected. So Professor Bagley says the safety of 10 helpless children depends on your silence. And he then goes on to explain that he is a secret agent who works for the American government, and he was using the tour as a front to help orphans cross out of communist Eastern Europe. And he also says that Eric Nagy, the guy on the tour, is in on it, and one of the 10 children is actually his cousin. And then Eric flirtily says that he'd be delighted to associate with the beautiful Nancy Drew, because it's also not a Nancy Drew book without Nancy having potential other love interests or people who are interested in her. But this is so funny. So Ned, who is across the room, takes this opportunity to get jealous, and he keeps looking between Nancy and Eric, and he volunteers to drive the bus since the bus driver bailed. I feel like Ned is not doing this for purely altruistic reasons. Like, he's not just like, oh yeah, I'll drive the bus because it benefits all of us. I feel like he's also doing it like, hey Nancy, look at me, I want to help too. So Professor Bagley also confesses that he wanted his bag to get stolen. This was kind of a plot twist, but before he can explain why, Bess runs inside and says she thinks the bus is going to explode. So remember all those banging noises from earlier? We're about to figure out why those are happening. So everyone runs outside to investigate, and Nancy discovers that the noises they were hearing were coming from a man tied up in the luggage compartment underneath the bus, and he's the real bus driver. So he's very mad at them for not knowing that the other guy was a phony bus driver, and he says, did he look like a bus driver? No. Now I look like a bus driver. Pray tell, what does a bus driver look like? Also, this guy is in like long red flannel underwear because the other guy stole his bus driver uniform. So Ned consoles him and takes him to get some new clothes, and the driver yells at everyone to not touch his bus. So everyone's laughing, but Eric says it was probably pretty scary for that guy to be tied up and put under the bus. And so Bess is like, oh, he's so sensitive. And she says, oh, Nancy, I think Eric has a crush on you, which of course Nancy denies. So next, Professor Bagley speaks to Nancy in private and finishes explaining that he wanted the men to steal falsified documents with the wrong details about the children's boarding passes from his luggage at the airport. So Professor Bagley was basically just leaving little breadcrumbs for the villains, like a false lead, so they would be over there while they were taking the kids over the border and out another direction. So next, the real bus driver resumes his duties, and he is, according to the book, obsessed with Mozart, so much so that while he's talking about him, he almost runs off the road. And when they finally arrive at their hotel, Professor Bagley says someone called 4 hours ago and canceled their reservations. So now they've driven all this way and they have nowhere to stay. So right on cue, a man comes up who says his name is Adolf Guterman, and he says he can help the group find rooms, but he's very pushy and domineering. He's described as a large man with a black mustache, but Professor Bagley and the whole group don't like this guy. They're like, we don't trust him, or they just don't like his mannerisms. So Professor Bagley is like, well, I'll see if the hotel staff can figure it out for us because they're the ones we've booked the reservations through. But unfortunately, the hotel manager can't find them rooms, so the group is forced to take Guterman's help. So the group checks into the hotel that Guterman found for them, and Nancy goes down the street to use a payphone to call Carson. And he says that Kurt Kessler, a noted filmmaker who escaped Eastern Europe, has had his film showing the atrocities of communism stolen. Even the developer had their building burned down, so there's no negatives of the film either. And the film is called Captive Witness. So Carson also gives Nancy a contact at the film festival. His name is Richard Ernst, and a description of 2 men, and they match the men who have caused them problems, the fake bus driver and porter. And while Carson is telling Nancy this, she says she thinks she heard a noise and the line is being tapped. And then Carson says they installed something at the Drews' house that prevents wiretapping, so it has to be on Nancy's end. But that doesn't really sound possible. Like, I've never heard of that. Like, and this is in the 80s. Like, I don't think they had that technology. but that's just me. But then the line goes dead and Nancy hears a crash on top of the phone booth and the light goes out. This would freak me out. But there's a man slowly strolling towards her, and luckily it's just Professor Bagley. It's not anybody else that's a bad guy, but he says the hotel desk clerk recommended he use the payphone the same way he told Nancy to, since the phones were all being used in the lobby, which is just really, really suspicious. So maybe they were being wiretapped. So the next day, Nancy decides she's just going to leave the tour and go to investigate the missing film in Vienna. And I mean, I get it. She's helping her dad with that mystery, but kind of rude to leave the tour. Also, I seriously doubt that a college-led tour would let you do that. Like, there's so many safety issues with that, but anyway. But Nancy is talking to Bess and George about finding a way to get there, and wouldn't you know, Herr Guterman overhears and humbly offers his driving services. And Ned overhears the exchange, and he gets mad/jealous, but Nancy confides later that she wants him to come along. She's like, no, I would never go with this guy alone. I don't trust him. So Nancy and Ned set off with Herr Guterman, and he is notably annoyed that Ned is coming along. Like, he thought Nancy was going to be the only one, and so he's very aggravated. But Nancy notices that the car has been freshly painted, and it's a brown color, and as they drive off, Ned notes that the car engine is nearly silent, just like the car that almost ran him down. And then Herr Guterman jumps out, and the man who stole the bus, his name is Herr Berger, gets in to drive, and Herr Guterman starts taking all this padding out of his shirt and removing a fake mustache. Like, dude is wearing a disguise. Like, this is what I meant when I was like James Bond-esque villains, because who does that? But it turns out that Herr Guterman is the man who tried to take Professor Bagley's luggage at the airport. And this part was just so funny to me. The lengths this man went to disguise himself. I mean, he padded his shirt, the fake mustache, like, just what is going on? So next, Guterman begins taunting Nancy and Ned and saying that the doors are locked and the windows are tinted, and the back of the car where Nancy and Ned are is soundproofed, so they can yell as loud as they want, but no one's gonna hear them, basically. And he says that it's so airtight back there that he can cut their air supply off. Like, this is some James Bond level villain stuff. I was like, what? This doesn't come standard on a Toyota Corolla. So this whole time, Nancy and Ned are kind of trying to keep their cool because Nancy knows the men can overhear them back there, so she starts talking about the weather and other random things. And honestly, okay, this is gonna date me, but this reminded me of the Steve Martin Pink Panther movie from like the early aughts, and like how he was in that movie and he was like, what lovely weather we are having. I hope the weather stays this mild. Props to Nancy for being able to talk about mundane things as if nothing bad is happening. That would not be me. That would not be the case. I would be like, we're gonna die. I'm gonna die in the Alps with this evil villain, and I'm in the back of this car and I don't know what's happening. So Nancy's talking about the weather, and meanwhile she's also writing notes to Ned, and she tells him she has, and this is crazy, a book that says noodles on the spine, and the two O's have holes in them, and Nancy says she can shoot tear gas out of it. Excuse me, what? What? Like, how? How is this possible? How did you get through TSA with that, Nancy? Like, I mean, maybe, okay, this was in the 80s, you know, TSA was pretty much non-existent before 9/11, so okay, I'll give her that, but what kind of book is this? Like, you cannot go pick up a book that shoots tear gas from Barnes & Noble, okay? Also, the fact that it says noodles, I'm just picturing this book with pasta illustrations on the front, like, oh, this is Italian recipes. Nobody will ever know that there's a weapon inside. I mean, where do you get a book like that? Do you get it from, like, Spies R Us? There's all these spy gadgets at this store. And I feel like Carson Drew, at the end of the month, he has to look at his credit card statement, because we know Nancy's not buying this stuff herself. Like, she's on her dad's money. I know he's got to be looking at this credit card statement and being like, okay, I see where Hannah bought groceries, Nancy bought some shoes for herself, and oh, okay, Spies R Us, $32.99. Looks like Nancy bought herself a book that sprays tear gas. Like, It's just so dumb. It's just so unbelievable. And I feel like Carson would just be like, well, it's Nancy, so I'm sure it's fine. So Herr Berger starts driving erratically, and the whole time, Guterman is just taunting them and saying, have you had enough, Miss Drew? And he gets angry when Nancy says, no, this driving doesn't scare me, because they're driving on a mountain, like mountain roads alongside these dangerous cliffs, and Herr Berger gets cocky, and around one of the turns in the road, he goes head on into the other lane towards a truck. So he's forced to bail, and they end up hanging in the car over a cliff from the guardrail. So Guterman starts speculating how to get out of the situation, and eventually, through some maneuvering, they're able to get the car back on the road, and thankfully, Nancy and Ned don't go over the cliff. But it's kind of funny because they have this back and forth conversation with Nancy and Ned in the back of the car, and Nancy's like, well, we can get out one at a time, and then you guys can get out, and then Guterman's like, no, you're just gonna let the car fall, and we have to balance the weight properly, and it's just this whole thing. So finally, they end up at this shepherd's hut, and Berger and Guterman take Nancy inside and leave Ned in the back of the car. And Guterman says Nancy will want to answer their questions quickly because they left the car off, and Ned will only have air for a little while. Ugh. So Guterman questions Nancy, and when he sits this iced coffee in front of her, she sees her opportunity. So she throws it in his face, grabs the car keys and this plank of wood by the door, and places it across the door once she's outside in a sort of lock, barring the villains inside. Because that's one thing that Nancy notes when she first gets there, the fact that there's a wood beam that goes across the door on the outside. Guterman has held people in this shack before, which is creepy. And iced coffee has once again saved the day. Is anyone surprised? Not me. So Nancy locks herself in the car where Ned is struggling to breathe in the back seat, and Guterman and Berger actually punch a hole in the door of the shack and they're able to get out, but Nancy has locked the car at this point, and so Guterman lays in front of the car because he says Nancy won't hit him and kill him. This guy has a lot of faith in this teenage girl, because I'm just saying, if it had been me, if I had been abducted in the Alps with my boyfriend and then you had locked said boyfriend in the back of this car and said, oh yeah, he's only got so much time to breathe, I don't think I would think twice about rolling over you with a car. I'm just saying, this guy, he must know that Nancy is just morally pure. So Nancy, meanwhile, finds this secondary ignition on the car and starts the car and floors it in reverse so they can escape. And so thankfully, Ned is able to breathe again. So Nancy and Ned drive for a ways, and Nancy says they'll leave the car in an inconvenient place, but she thinks the car is amphibious. She has no reason to suspect this, but I mean, it does a lot of other weird things. So she's right. So they're just floating in this car down a river through the Alps, because of course they are, but it gets worse. It gets so much worse. It always has to get worse before it gets better in these Nancy Drew books. So I'm going to give you some multiple choice options for what you think is going to happen next. Nancy Drew and Ned Nickerson are floating in an amphibious car down a river in the Alps. What do you think's going to happen next? A. The car actually wasn't amphibious, so it sinks. B. The car explodes and bursts into flames. C. The car is actually like Herbie the Love Bug and has a mind of its own, and it spits Nancy and Ned out on the banks of the river. Or D. There's loud noises coming from up ahead which sound very ominous, so I'm thinking there's a waterfall. So if you guess D, there's a waterfall up ahead, you are correct! So Nancy and Ned end up going over this small waterfall in the car, and then they see an even bigger one downstream. So Nancy somehow maneuvers the car to this small riverbank, and they're able to get out, thankfully, because that would have been bad. They have not gone over a huge waterfall since the Double Jinx mystery. It's funny, though, because Nancy and Ned say almost regretfully that it's going to be hard for Guterman to get his car back. And I was like, I'm sorry, the guy kidnapped you, tried to kill you. If it's inconvenient for him to get his car back, good, all the better. That is fine with me. So they leave the car, walk to the nearest town, and catch a bus to Vienna. But before they can pull off, Nancy hears a voice yelling, "Wait!" And it's Guterman. I'm sorry, how did this man get out of the Alps on foot so quickly? Like, did he just hitch a ride with someone? Like, it's been hours. Like, how did he catch up to them that fast? But Nancy and Ned, they end up disguising themselves with scarves and a hat, and they pretend to be asleep so Guterman won't recognize them. So Guterman and his crony Berger sit down next to them, and Guterman complains in German that Berger shouldn't have made iced coffee or they wouldn't be in this mess. And Guterman also says that Berger should have laid down behind the car while he was laying in front of the car. Like, they're just going over these things in their heads like it would have made any difference. But here is another skill of Nancy's. She knows some German because she's able to hear what they're talking about and understand it. But I think it's actually mentioned in the witch tree symbol too that Nancy knows a little bit of German. So when the bus finally gets to Vienna, Nancy and Ned slip off after Guterman and Berger leave, and they go to a hotel where the book says they have separate rooms, of course. No scandal here. But Ned calls Nancy from his room, and it turns out the car was found and it made the news. I'm just picturing Ned flicking on the television in the hotel room, and this Austrian-German news channel is on, and there's this car being like airlifted out of the Alps. Like, oh my gosh. So they call Professor Bagley and they let him know they're okay because, you know, they left the tour group. I'm sure they're like, okay, where are Nancy and Ned? Like, we need an update. But Professor Bagley lets them know that Eric's wheelchair was almost stolen by this guy when they carried him into the bathroom because it wouldn't fit through the door. So that's kind of weird. Like, why was this person trying to steal his wheelchair? Also, very mean. So when Nancy hangs up the phone, she hears a sound at her door and she sees an envelope come under it. Okay, I can't resist. Let's play another game. Nancy Drew gets an envelope slipped under the door of her hotel room. What do you think's inside? Is it A, tickets to Sound of Music, the musical? B, lottery numbers? C, a proposal from Ned Nickerson who's staying in the hotel room next door? Or D, a threat from a villain? Yeah, it was D. There was a threat inside the envelope, so it's addressed to Nancy Drew, car thief, and so Nancy flings the door open, but of course the hallway's empty at that point, and the note says, "Dear Nancy Drew, you are to cease all independent effort to kidnap the children and to find the film captive witness. If you persist, you will be hurt. If the price is right, however, it may be possible for you to obtain both the children and the film. Be in the hotel lobby at 9 p.m. Come alone. I will take you to see the film to prove I have it. You have my word of honor that you will not be harmed. You will be returned safely. Afterward, we can talk about what I really seek from you people. G." Of course, G standing for Guterman. So this guy said he was going to return you safely and you have his word of honor, like that means anything, and you won't be harmed. Like, he said that 2 or 3 times, so I don't believe him. I want nothing more to do with this man. So Nancy calls Richard Ernst, the contact she has at the film festival next, and she goes to see him, and he says a man who fits Berger's description came and said he had a replacement film for the captive witness entry, and while Ernst went to ask someone a question, the man stole the original film and left a blank film in the canister. So on a hunch, Nancy asks to see the canister and she sees an address on it, which she and Ned get a taxi to. And it's a shady area of Vienna, and the taxi driver says people will steal the fillings from your teeth out here. That's pretty intense. So Nancy and Ned climb in an open window to the film factory and they encounter a Doberman which tries to attack them, but Ned sprays it with Nancy's tear gas book. Well, at least we finally used that thing and we know that it works. I would have much preferred you use it on Guterman, but oh well. So Nancy and Ned go back to the hotel and Nancy doesn't tell Ned that she's going to meet with Guterman at 9 p.m. So she goes to the lobby and Berger and Guterman drive Nancy blindfolded to somewhere in Vienna where they play the film Captive Witness for her. But this is so unsafe. I'm like, Nancy, you should have told Ned. I know the note said not to, but that's so scary, being blindfolded. And Guterman says that it's all lies, the Captive Witness film. It's nothing but lies, but he'll let Nancy have the film and help the 10 orphans in exchange for Kurt Kessler, the guy who made the film. This was scary. I was like, this guy is working for, I mean, obviously the bad guys, but like, we're using this man's life as a human bargaining chip. This is very spy movie, spy novel. I approve, not of using someone's life as a human bargaining chip, watch it, but as like it very much fits that genre, I guess you could say. So now our heroine, Nancy Drew, faces a very strong moral dilemma. Do you give up this man's life in exchange for helping these 10 orphans get out of communist Eastern Europe, and you get this propaganda film that needs to be shown to the world, or do you not do that? And then Guterman is just going to try and mess with your plans to save these kids. So they take Nancy back to the hotel where she calls Carson and she explains everything that's going on, and he talks to Kessler, and Carson says his client agrees to help. Now, next, Nancy and Ned try to find where Nancy was taken last night by Guterman, so she could hear trains and a merry-go-round from where they were, wherever it was. And so Ned agrees to help, but he's also upset that Nancy didn't tell him she was going with Guterman, which I completely understand. I'm with Ned on this one. So next, Nancy gets a snack with Professor Bagley because they've been reunited, and Eric and Ned are there, and Nancy gets them caught up to speed. And Professor Bagley says Kurt Kessler can't be taken captive, and he's also supposed to be contacted by an informant about the date and time of the border crossing. So literally right after he says this, all of a sudden this man at this adjacent table behind the professor says he is an informant and has details, but before he can get anything else out, he collapses in a seizure. But he keeps pointing at Eric for some reason, and then Nancy tells the paramedics that she's his niece so she can ride in the ambulance and go with him. So they check his wallet, and his name is Robert Haberman. And little does Nancy know, Berger and Guterman are following the ambulance because they're evil villains and that's what they do. And I don't know if anyone listening out there watched the show Pretty Little Liars, but this scene made me think of one of the later seasons when this ambulance goes off carrying Mr. Fitz, and then A is on top of the roof of the ambulance. I was just like, oh my gosh. That show and this book have a lot in common. There's a lot of things that are just unbelievable. So Haberman turns out to be okay, but he's unconscious, and Nancy catches Guterman trying to claim that he's his brother. And so Nancy tells a guard at the hospital that this isn't true and asks Guterman to identify the man's name. She's like, well, if you're his brother, then what's your last name? And so when he can't, the guard leads him away, and he's furious. Checkmate, Adolf Guterman. So at this point in the mystery, Nancy calls Professor Bagley again, and he says someone tried to steal Eric's wheelchair again, and so Nancy just figures it out. It's like this light bulb clicks in her head, and she figures out why Haberman was pointing at Eric so much when he was having that seizure. And so Nancy rushes back to the hotel, and they take the wheelchair apart, and inside the seat they find an envelope and instructions to take the children over the Hungarian border. This next thing that I wrote down, I said, side note, Nancy also says she could just kiss Eric out of excitement at finding this, and Ned says half jokingly, better not. He is so jealous. So Nancy, Ned, the professor, and Eric are talking, and this stranger knocks on the door to the hotel room and says he's Emil Popov, and he has the children at a cabin ready to cross when the plan is put into action. And Nancy can tell he's had a long journey, so they let him wash up and get him some room service while Professor Bagley makes a phone call and speaks in code. And everyone tries to think of how they can get across the Hungarian border undetected, and Ned suggests a balloon, which honestly seems like the worst possible idea. Like, yeah, let's load these orphans into this balloon where they can get shot down by communists. So Mr. Popov has to leave eventually, but Nancy says they'll get him a duck call because they'll need it to communicate during the operation, as it will be dark. And then there's this huge plot twist where Eric reveals that he can in fact walk and he doesn't need his wheelchair, which I kind of saw something coming with that, but I was also kind of hoping that we were getting some representation of a wheelchair using character in a Nancy Drew book, but no. And then Nancy, Eric, and Ned decide that they're going to let Bert, Dave, Bess, and George in on the plan, and Nancy has an interesting list of things for them to find. She's like, okay, we need duck calls, inner tubes, a wig, scuba gear, and an 1880s ball gown, and some grease paint. I'm sure we can find all of that on short notice, but before the group can leave to get the items, Ned directs Nancy's attention to this blue car across the street. And it's Guterman, and he's looking up at their window and blowing kisses, and he is just such an over-the-top villain. But they realize that Guterman probably has associates ready to trail them on their supply run, so they'll have to split up because they don't want them to know what they're getting or what they're going to be using to help these kids get over the border. So Nancy makes some phone calls but decides to cause some mischief by writing down some random phone numbers for an exterminator, an opera house, and some others, and she accidentally drops it for one of the henchmen of Guterman to find. And at this point, Kurt Kessler, Carson Drew's client, has been flown to where they are to help with their plan. So when everyone regroups, Nancy lays out the plan, and Bert's going to pretend to be Eric, and Eric's going to help Nancy get the kids across the border, and George is going to disguise herself as Nancy and be a decoy with Ned, and Professor Bagley has also volunteered to be a decoy. Of course, Ned gets jealous that Eric gets to go with Nancy, but Nancy explains that he knows Hungarian, German, Czech, Russian, Polish, and Romanian, so she needs his help. Poor Ned, he just knows football. So the next day, the plan is set in motion and the group leaves, and it's funny because before they do, Ned and George come knock on Nancy's door, and George is wearing this strawberry blonde Nancy wig, and she and Ned are pretending to look at each other like a couple in love. So while everyone's leaving the hotel, Nancy sees Guterman's men follow the group, and she worries where he is because he's not with these cronies. So Nancy disguises herself with the brunette wig that they got and this ball gown, and Eric wears a black wig and mustache, and they take off in a car, but Guterman and Berger do end up following them. So Nancy and Eric stop at a gas station, get some cans of oil, and then Nancy pours them out the window, causing the villain's car to slide off and into a swamp. This is like something straight out of a cartoon. So when Nancy and Eric finally arrive at the lake where part of their plan will begin, Nancy's dad has a friend named George Waldheim who's there, and he pulled some strings so Nancy can perform in this opera because of course Nancy is apparently a convincing enough soprano that she can be in this opera. Is there any talent that she doesn't possess? So Nancy goes on stage and sings, and she sees Guterman in the audience, and meanwhile Eric lashes together these inner tubes and uses grease paint on his face because they have to blend in the dark. So after the performance, Nancy sneaks down to the water to join Eric, and she hears Guterman asking around backstage where Nancy Drew is. So now they know that time is definitely of the essence. So Nancy and Eric are able to use this duck call that they have to get to the orphans who get on the inner tubes while Nancy and Eric pull them through the water, and they get them across the border after Eric distracts a patrol boat. So the kids are free, they're out of this communist Eastern European country, which is kind of vaguely referenced but never named, and Nancy is happy, but she's disappointed that she didn't find the missing film, Captive Witness. But when Nancy's talking to Kurt Kessler, he asks Nancy to describe the sounds she remembers while being led to the warehouse blindfolded by Guterman, and he gets excited when she mentions train noises and a carousel, and Nancy also remembers walking up 12 steps into the building. So they find a building with 12 steps near those sounds, and inside is Guterman, who Kessler calls Heinrich Hagerdorn. So he's been using an alias this whole time, but this time I find it acceptable because it's like we didn't have 2 or 3 aliases, we just had one. But Kurt Kessler says he knew Guterman, who is really Hagerdorn, and he was another filmmaker, one of the best, and his parents were killed by the Nazis, and Hagerdorn went to prison for a film that he made against the atrocities perpetuated by the Nazis, but he was released on the condition he would be a spy for the bad side. But when Kessler escaped from custody with the help of Hagerdorn, Hagerdorn was punished severely and his wife and children were killed in a not-so-accidental car accident. This is really, really sad, and I actually feel bad for a villain for once in my life. But Hagerdorn gives the Captive Witness film back, and Kurt Kessler goes on to win the Vienna Film Festival with it, saying it wouldn't have been possible without Nancy Drew. Drew. And then at the very end of the book, we of course get the title for the next book, which is pretty customary in the Nancy Drew series. But the next book in the series is mentioned as The Gondolier's Secret, which that is incorrect. The name was later changed to The Winged Lion Mystery. So that is the end of my notes for Captive Witness. Also, I should have mentioned this at the beginning of the episode, but this is the book that the game Captive Curse is loosely based on, and it's not even, the only thing that's similar is that it kind of takes place in Germany. Nothing else is similar. So now let's go on to a segment that I like to call What's Cooking. So in this book, we had a lot of drinks. We had iced coffee, orange juice, hot chocolate, and then we had a mentioning of croissants with butter and jam. Now onto the things that I think Nancy could add to her resume. So I said that Nancy could consider herself an amphibious car expert because she knew that Guterman's car could work on water, which was kind of crazy. She can consider herself an opera singer. I guess she can hit those high notes. And she's now a border crosser. She crossed the border of Hungary. So as for the things I liked and didn't like about Captive Witness, the things I liked, honestly, the over-the-top villains were hilarious. This was a very entertaining book to read, so if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. Tear gas book, amphibious car, like some of the gadgets in this book were just so funny. Now, as far as the things I didn't like, I really didn't like the American propaganda in this book. It was like the people writing it were like, okay, this is a kid's book, but we're going to talk about world issues in such a way. It was weird. There wasn't really much mystery to this book, so that's my one complaint. But still, I have to give this book a magnifying glass rating of 2.5 magnifying glasses just for the sheer entertainment. Like, it's a bad book. It doesn't make any sense logically to me in a lot of ways, but it's funny. It's a funny book. It would definitely go on the list of weirdest Nancy Drew books I've ever read. So that concludes today's episode on The Captive Witness. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I'll see you guys back here next week for Mystery of the Winged Lion. So if you like books where Nancy goes to Venice, Italy, you're gonna love this one. That's all I've got. Do you really need another reason? Like, Venice, Italy is one of my favorite places in the entire world. So any of the books where Nancy goes to Italy, I get super excited, but in particular Venice especially. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.